Thank you for that kind introduction. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Is the sound correct just before I start? Yeah. Just before I start, I'd like to thank Sabine Penot, curator of Old Masters, for her kind invitation to speak tonight, and also the sponsors of this event, the Dorothy M. Auction House, and to Catherine Riedel for her brilliant organization. My talk this evening will explore Pieter Bruegel the Elder's work from a stylistic and technical point of view. But I'll also explore the fascinating phenomenon of the copies of his paintings, which were reproduced in vast numbers by his elder son, Pieter, and to a lesser extent, his younger son, Jan, at the end of the 16th and the first part of the 17th century. I'll reveal precisely how the sons were able to imitate their father's works with such exactitude, even when they couldn't see them with their own eyes. And I'll show you what that tells us about Bruegel the Elder's own preparatory work for painting. I'll also touch on the tricky subject of attribution. In the 17th century, such was the renown of Bruegel the Elder that many anonymous imitators made their living by reproducing his popular scenes. Sometimes it takes a forensic approach to distinguish between Pieter Bruegel the Younger's copies, those of his workshop assistants, those of his contemporaries, and those of later imitators. And of course, that's a problem for the art market. I'll finish with an old favorite, the famous Fall of Icarus by Pieter Bruegel the Elder. But is it really by him? This talk couldn't have been done without the collaboration of Dominique Allart, Bruegel expert and professor at Liège University, with whom I co-wrote The Bruegel Phenomenon, which is a book, as you've heard, on technique and connoisseurship of the Pieter Bruegels, which we published in 2012. So let me just first say just a few words about my background. I was originally trained as a painting restorer, but I consider myself a technical art historian, studying artist techniques and materials at the Royal Institute of Cultural Heritage you see here. This is a Belgian federal institution, and our mission is the scientific study and conservation of works of art of national heritage. And this is our beautiful conservation studio with my colleague Livia Dupert, who is the painting restorer who worked on the Pieter Bruegels de la Griet, and which you have all seen in its glorious restored state in the exhibition. So as you heard, I manage the Photography and Scientific Imagery Unit, and here you see a version of Pieter Bruegel the Younger's Massacre of the Innocents from Sibiu in Romania. It's being examined in infrared by Sophie de Potter, and as you will soon see, this sort of examination takes you on a journey inside the paintings themselves and lets you see things that only the artist knew about. So it's really art history from the painter's perspective. So let's get back to Pieter Bruegel the Elder. His work went well beyond the well-trodden ground of Italianism, which was fashionable at that time in the Low Countries. Although he spent some time in Italy as a young man, Bruegel chose not to paint Roman ruins, beautiful women, and classical gods and goddesses. Instead, he chose to depict homely Flemish themes, landscapes, peasant festivities, and scenes of working life of the rural peasants. But he managed to instill in these familiar scenes a sense of universal resonance. And it's this, the portrayal of human activity in all its facets, that still attracts us today. And even now, after 450 years, we can relate to these paintings in many different ways. They were, and they still are, conversation pieces. So if you stand in front of the Flemish proverbs, as the original owner and his friends would have done, you can't help but wonder what all these small scenes are telling you, and you inevitably recognize some of them. In my case, I noticed the one with the man banging his head against a brick wall, which refers to trying to do or argue something against strong opposition. And this one, which means to kill two flies with one clap, which is still in use in Dutch and French today and means to be particularly efficient. In English, we tend to say to kill two birds with one stone. Bruegel did paint traditional religious subject matter, but he filled these scenes with entertaining detail. In the tragic scene of the Massacre of the Innocents, although we are touched by the children torn away from their parents to be murdered in front of them, our eye is drawn to two dogs playing in the snow, oblivious of the tragedy, and to the comic motif in the background here of the soldier who has parked his horse against a tree and is busy relieving himself against a wall in all his armour. So Bruegel also plays on our morbid fascination for horror. These days, some of us like watching horror films. The more gory and bloody, the better. In Bruegel's day, it was no different, and you can see that in The Triumph of Death. There are some rather nasty breaking wheels in the background where you can see the birds who would have picked at the unfortunate victim's flesh as they lay dying. There's also a bit of sex here and there in his work, but very tastefully added. So if you look carefully at this peasant wedding, and you follow the direction of the suitably suggestive bagpipes, as pointed out in the catalogue of the exhibition by Sabine Peynaud and Elke Oberthaler, you can just make out in the shadows of the hayloft a couple doing exactly what you imagine they are doing. Today, this motif is much more clear in infrared, but must have been visible when the painting was first made. And in fact, we can see the figures clearly in a copy by Pieter Bruegel the Younger. And I wonder whether this subtle allusion to forbidden pleasures may suggest that the marriage being celebrated is a shotgun wedding and that the bride is already pregnant. Again, Peynaud and Oberthaler suggest that the presence of bagpipes could bring the bride's virginity into question. Today, we tend to concentrate so much on the richness and wealth of meaning in Bruegel's paintings that we can forget how innovative they were in terms of their technique and style. And of course, that's what attracts me personally, given my background as a painting restorer. So here, in The Return of the Hunters, you can appreciate Bruegel's easy virtuosity with the brush. And here again, with a marvelous economy of touch, Bruegel depicts a chimney fire and the efforts of the people trying to put it out. I would encourage you all to check out the new Inside Bruegel website of the Kunsthistorisches Museum if you haven't seen it already, where you can see all these details for yourselves. Bruegel's style broke with the tradition of the previous century, with its meticulous finish, so typical of the Flemish primitives. His pictorial language is more spontaneous, and he employed novel brushwork to achieve new heights of expression. Here, for example, in the Procession to Calvary, he used a blunt point, probably the end of a brush, to mark in the design in the dress of a horn player. And here, in the Census at Bethlehem, he has used dabs of thick paint to give the impression of really genuine snowballs. And in the sky, he's worked his paint in an almost impressionistic manner. And here, in the Sermon of St. John the Baptist, he's used his fingers, if you see here, to soften the red stripe on the gypsy's garment. With Bruegel, there was a genuine switch to a more modern means of expression. In the Dullegriet, the faces are painted in an almost caricatural manner. With just a few brushstrokes, Bruegel captures the essence of his subject, as well as amusing us. In the decades following his death in 1569, his paintings and drawings were avidly sought after by collectors. A source tells us, for instance, that the Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolf II, sent emissaries to Europe to try to acquire more works by Bruegel for his castle in Prague. And indeed, the Dullegriet was apparently a gift to the emperor around 1600 from some merchants from Emden in Lower Saxony, presumably wishing to curry favor with him. So when he died in 1569, Bruegel was still at the height of his powers at just over the age of 40. He never knew he was to be the start of a powerful dynasty of artists. His sons both went on to become successful painters. The elder son, Pieter Bruegel the Younger, concentrated on making faithful copies, where the younger son, Jan Bruegel the Elder, became a renowned artist in his own right. And then you have their children, and then you have your grandchildren, and many of these became painters. So the immediate descendants of the illustrious Pieter Bruegel the Elder include numerous artists of talent spread over 3 generations. But it was Pieter Bruegel the Younger in particular who claimed his heritage as the legitimate continuator of his father. He produced, a multitude of replicas, that is to say, identical copies of the paintings, so close it's very difficult to tell them apart. And what's exceptional is the volume of replicas produced by Bruegel the Younger studio. And what's mysterious also are the circumstances of this production. Bruegel the Younger was only 4 or 5 years old when his father died, so he couldn't have trained with him. And the vast majority of his father's paintings were already in the hands of wealthy private collectors, some of them living far away from the Low Countries. So without his father's training, and without the paintings, how did he produce such faithful copies on such a large scale? That was the challenge of my doctoral thesis on Pieter Bruegel the Younger. I should point out that Bruegel the Younger set up his business as a copyist and not as a forger. When his copies are signed, they carry inscriptions that are slightly different to those of his father, and the same goes for Jan. So Peter the Elder never added a P for Peter in front of his name. Peter the Younger, on the other hand, always had a P in front of his name and added an H after the G. And Jan Bruegel never added a J for Jan and has an H as well. The sons' signatures are often dated as well, which obviously removes any confusion with those of their father. So I'm going to tackle the copying question through 4 very beautiful compositions, the first being the wedding dance in the open air. In this particular case, the original version by Pieter Bruegel the Elder does not survive, but it still presents the perfect example for introducing the question of Pieter Bruegel the Younger's copying practice, as well as that of his brother Jan, and how you can tell the difference between the 2 brothers' copies. I was able to study 5 examples of the composition from Bruegel the Younger studio shown here. And this one is from the Royal Museums of Fine Arts in Brussels. I examined all the paintings with infrared reflectography, which enables you to see literally through the paint and visualize any preparatory drawing that the artist might have made. Here we are. You can see the outlines for all the figures, which would have guided the artist during painting. So we call this the underdrawing. And in this detail, you can see the lively nature of the contours. They were clearly applied freehand in a dark drawing material. Bruegel has quickly sketched in all he needs to guide him or one of his assistants during painting, including little squiggles here and there for tone and contour. The drawing material that he used is either black chalk or graphite. I took a few samples of underdrawing from 6 of Bruegel the Younger's works, and of those 5 were in graphite and 1 in black chalk. And although black chalk had been used since at least the 14th century, graphite was a new material for artists and was first illustrated in a so-called lead pencil in 1565 in Gessner's treatise on fossils. And in the Bruegel exhibition, you'll see the recent theory put forward by Babette Hartwig, painting restorer at the Stedelijk Museum in Berlin, that Bruegel the Elder himself used graphite for underdrawing the 2 monkeys in 1562. So clearly, Bruegel the Younger had recourse to a mechanical or semi-mechanical method of copying, particularly if you consider the vast numbers of copies produced. And in the case of the wedding dance, we know of at least 31 identical versions from his studio. So what was possible during the period? We have squaring up, the use of pricked cartoons, tracing, which also involved the use of cartoons, and rather unusual but worth mentioning, the pantograph, whose use was described by Christophorus Scheiner in 1631. I tested all these methods myself and found that the pantograph, which is mainly for enlarging and reducing a design, is the least practical of all. The pushing and pulling actions required to move the arms give jerky and mechanical outlines, and quite unlike the underdrawing seen in Bruegel's copies. So we're left to decide which of the other 3 methods he could have used. To see just how close Bruegel's copies are to one to the other, I traced myself the compositions onto PVC film and superposed the results. And here you see me tracing a version of the Massacre of the Innocents. If squaring up were used, we wouldn't expect the same kind of accuracy as transferring a design using a cartoon. So in the case of the wedding dance, I photographed my tracings and gave the outlines different colors. And here you have the result of overlaying two of these versions. You can see that although the panels are not the same size, the figural composition fits precisely. And this suggests that a cartoon was indeed used. However, as you see, the trees don't fit together, so the background must have been added freehand. I'm now going to introduce you to one of the only two copies of the composition by Jan Bruegel, Pieter's younger brother. This is a beautiful composition on copper, but as you might notice, it's painted the other way around to Pieter's. All the figures are inverted, as are the buildings. During the early part of Jan's career, he did make some copies of his father's works, but never more than one or two of each composition. Later on, he did his own thing and painted quite different themes, such as allegories, flower paintings, and mythological scenes. Although sometimes he integrated motifs from his father, restyled and recolored to fit his own vision. But in his faithful copies, can we tell the difference between his ones and those of his brother Pieter? And in fact, we can. So let's first compare their painting style. Pieter the Younger's is delicate, even graphic in his approach. He seems to draw with a brush. His paint layers are thin and often translucent. Jan Bruegel is also very delicate and precise, but he paints in a more painterly manner. His paint layer is opaque rather than translucent, and his brushwork is finely blended. And if we zoom in here on one of the dances, we can also appreciate a big difference in their use of color. Jan simply loved bright ultramarine blue, whereas Pieter's blues are generally more subdued. Here, in fact, Pieter's jacket is plain black, which stands in stark contrast to Jan's gorgeous shot silk garment with its translucent red shadows. Here again, I show you Pieter's more graphic approach, with its typical use of tiny vertical brushwork to emphasize the eye sockets, which is quite unlike Jan's smoothly blended flesh. In the landscape background, however, we can't see much difference in style. Both artists use a sort of shorthand formula to indicate clusters of leaves, and similarly, semi-translucent greens and yellows. So let's compare their underdrawings. This is one of Pieter's versions, and it shows a detailed outline drawing with quite a lively touch. And this is from Jan's version, which is also an outline drawing in a dry carbon-based medium, but clearly different in style, being slightly more wiry and nervous, and with some changes in outline between the drawing and the paint, as here, where the eyes have been shifted up a little during painting. The lines, I have to say, are more difficult to make out in Jan's version, which may be something to do with the fact that it is on copper panel. Finally, I also traced the painted composition of Jan's version, and when I flipped my tracing over and overlaid it with Pieter's versions, you get an almost perfect fit for the main figures. So this proves that Jan probably used the same cartoon as his brother, but the other way around. What this evidence doesn't reveal, and this is something I'm going to show you in the next case study, is exactly how the cartoons were used in Pieter Bruegel the Younger studio, and sometimes also by Jan. And so to discover this actual transfer process, we're going to look at the wonderful battle between Carnival and Lent. So this painting shows the ceremonies and customs associated with Mardi Gras, or Shrove Tuesday, which are beautifully explained and illustrated in a new little book published by the Kunsthistorisches Museum called Kompositionen Pieter. The jousting figures, personifying Carnival and Lent at the front, are surrounded by a variety of rituals and processions, contrasting feasting and merrymaking on the left with poverty, sickness, and religious charity on the right. And the authors of the new book see it as Bruegel's rather cynical take on things, showing in subtle ways how charity is basically designed to make a good impression on others rather than stemming from true altruistic intentions, and how beggars are determined businessmen and women rather than the poor victims you might initially be led to believe. Again, Bruegel's paintings can be read on various levels and was meant to stimulate conversation rather than providing a simple one-fits-all meaning. And this carnival festival is still celebrated in towns such as Binche in Wallonia in Belgium. The Gilles de Binche, they go out on procession in the town from 4 in the morning until late at night on Shrove Tuesday. And I wonder whether this little fellow here is a partial precursor to the modern-day Gilles, or at least the same type of character that peopled carnivals in Bruegel's day. Both are masked, and both carry bundles of twigs, apparently to ward off evil spirits. Both have hunchbacks stuffed with straw, and both carry baskets. And in the case of the Gilles, this is for oranges that they threw at the crowd. And it seems that Bruegel's little fellow has something heavy in his bag too, perhaps apples for throwing. And I can even spot traditions that we celebrate today in my own family. Every year, on the 6th of January, children in Belgium and France celebrate the Feast of the Epiphany, which is the visit of the three kings. We eat a galette des rois, and inside there is a small figurine that we call the fève, shown here. Following tradition, he or she who is lucky enough to receive the piece of the cake with the hidden fève is crowned king for the day, as was this child in Bruegel's painting in 1559, and as was my son Jeremy some 450 years later. I have to say he didn't win it on Sunday, so I couldn't update my image. Pieter Bruegel the Younger made at least 5 full-scale copies of this large format painting. And we're going to concentrate on the copy in the Royal Museums of Fine Arts of Belgium in Brussels. I studied this work in great detail after its purchase by the museum in June 1999 at auction at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. It's in exquisite condition. So let's go through the evidence for the copying process. So here you have a detail of a group of beggars. Behind the paint, as to be expected, is a typically detailed underdrawing. And here is a detail of a female beggar carrying a monkey-like child in a basket. And again, the drawing is, as much expected, fully underdrawn with every line indicated. And here is the strange masked reveller, also nicely and precisely drawn with hatching strokes to indicate tone on the inner side of the felt hat. But I haven't shown you yet the biggest clue as to Bruegel the Younger's transfer technique, and that's revealed here in the detail of the guitar player. So what you can make out in infrared are rows of tiny dots alongside the underdrawing, and here they are closer up. And this evidence proves the use of a pricked cartoon for the transfer of the image to panel. In this detail, you can see the pouncing dots in the figure of Carnival, and indeed they are slightly smudged, as if the artist moved his cartoon slightly during pouncing. But the figure of Lent, here, shows absolutely no dots at all. And in fact, this is what we would normally expect, as the pouncing powder should have been wiped away after underdrawing. The artist would not have wanted to take the risk of the black pigment dirtying the paint he was about to apply. And that is why we so rarely spot pouncing in infrared. So in this painting, the fact that pouncing marks remain at all was probably a technical mistake on the part of the artist. He may have started pouncing when the oil-based priming layer was still tacky. Consequently, in those areas, black pouncing dust was sealed into the priming layer. And for us, this mistake was the Rosetta Stone to our understanding of Bruegel the Younger's technique. And indeed, we are now sure that pouncing was the principal method of transfer for all Bruegel the Younger's copies. And we've even found it in Jan Bruegel's only full-scale copy after his father of the Sermon of St. John the Baptist, which I examined in the Kunstmuseum in Basel. And here is the infrared image. And if you look carefully, you can see faint pouncing dots around the outlines of the hand and that of the hat. And here I've highlighted them in red to make it clearer. So Peter, in this instance, shared his cartoons with his brother, probably just after Jan's return from Italy in 1596. We think that Jan may have worked in Pieter's studio during this time in order to make his copies after his father's works, although on a vastly different scale to his brother. Pieter made at least 24 copies of the Sermon of St. John, while Jan made only 2, one of which is much smaller. So just to make this process more easy to understand, I'd like to take you through the stages the Bruegel sons went in the making of their copies. First, they, or their panel supplier, took an oak plank of the finest quality, smoothed it down and sized it with animal glue. Then they gave it several coats of ground, which is made up of a mixture of chalk and rabbit skin glue. And I did these reconstructions with Bob Gase, whom you've seen here, who was panel restorer at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage. The ground was rubbed down between layers, so we used horsetail for this, which has silica in its stems and was a commonly used abrasive during the period. And then the oil-based priming layer was applied, which would have sealed the ground and given a slightly tinted surface on which to paint. Then a cartoon was made, and to make our cartoon, we used an infrared image of the Carnival and Lent, scaled to size, and we pricked straight through the pouncing marks. And then the design is pounced to panel using the traditional method with a little bag containing finely ground charcoal. And then the powdery dots would have been joined up with the black drawing material, here you see with black chalk. And any excess powder would have been wiped away with a pigeon wing or with a piece of rag. And this is our step-by-step reconstruction showing all the stages I've just described. Incidentally, although no cartoons survive from Bruegel the Younger studio, several cartoons for painting by Italian masters do survive, such as this one here by Leonardo da Vinci in the National Gallery, London, which is a large drawing made of lots of pieces of paper pasted together. And this one here by Raphael in the British Museum for a painting that's now in the National Gallery, London. In this case, we can clearly see that the design was transferred from the cartoon using the pouncing technique. Peter Cook, Bruegel the Elder's father-in-law and likely teacher, most probably used pricked cartoons in preparation for painting, such as for his many near-identical Last Supper scenes, and he certainly made them when he designed large tapestries, and we still have some of these. This surviving cartoon in the Brussels King's House for the tapestry of the Martyrdom of St. Paul is from about 1535. It's made up of many sheets pasted together and was recently restored by a Belgian-French team of conservators. And here it is after treatment. And when we go in more closely, you can see that the design is actually pricked for transfer to another support. And this was probably to make a second cartoon. For those of you who'd like to visualize this cartoon, you can go upstairs and see the marvelous cartoons Jan Vermeyen made in collaboration with Peter Cook in the 1540s for a tapestry series on Charles V's victory against the Ottomans. Bruegel himself may even have participated in their production while he was training with Peter Cook. Bruegel the Elder's familiarity in the use of cartoons through Peter Cook, of course, begs the question as to whether he himself could have made a cartoon or set of cartoons in preparation for the complex composition of the battle between Carnival and Lent. None of Bruegel the Elder's preparatory material for large-scale compositions has survived, although it is possible that this drawing from the Harvard University Art Museums is a copy of a lost sketch by Bruegel the Elder for the battle between Carnival and Lent, possibly made by Pieter Bruegel the Younger. On the verso of this sheet, you have some roughly drawn carnival figures. This drawing shows remarkable similarities with motifs in Bruegel's painting, although they are not identical, which suggests they're copies of trial sketches. But we are sure that sketches such as these were not the only things that Bruegel the Younger inherited from his father for this composition. In fact, we can prove that he must also have inherited a set of full-scale cartoons and probably also a model drawing of the whole composition. So let's consider the evidence. What I haven't mentioned is that of the 5 copies, there are 3 extremely faithful ones and 2 atypical ones. And the atypical ones vary in motif and colour. Here you have the detail of the guitar player in the original version. And here in the extremely faithful Brussels Royal Museum's version. The reason he appears a little pale in comparison to the original is simply due to fading of the lake pigment. And here you have one of the atypical versions, which was last sold at Sotheby's in 2012. You can see straight away that the cooking pot hat is brown in the original and faithful copy, but black in the atypical copy. Also, the jug hanging from the man's waist, it's ceramic in the original and faithful copy, but pewter in the metal in the atypical version. More significant, though, is this sword worn by the figure in the Sotheby's copy. When you look at the Brussels version in infrared, you can spot the telltale dots of a sword shape, proving that the motif was present in Bruegel the Younger's prick cartoon. And here I annotate it in red so you can see it better. Notice that he doesn't join up the dots in this underdrawing for this particular motif. And now, thanks to the Inside Bruegel website, you can peek behind the surface of Bruegel the Elder's original version too. Lo and behold, there is an underdrawn line for this sword, here marked in red. It would seem that all 3 artists used the same cartoon. So let's look at a couple more motifs to test this theory. So here's my favorite child, the Roi de la Fève in the original version, here in the Brussels version, and here in the atypical Sotheby's version. Notice that the child holds up a sheet with a fève in the original and faithful copy, but only his hand in the atypical version. Again, in the infrared image of the Brussels version, you can see pouncing marks for this hand, which haven't been joined up during underdrawing. And in the infrared image of the original, you can see underdrawing lines for this hand that Bruegel the Elder decided to drop during painting. Again, it suggests that all 3 paintings were based on the same cartoon. Here's another nice example in the woman pulling a coffin on wheels. In the original version, and in the faithful version in Brussels, her arm is bent. But in the atypical version here, it's outstretched. Look under the surface in the Brussels version, and you see pouncing dots of an outstretched arm, which is how it appeared on the cartoon. However, the dots are not joined up, suggesting that Bruegel the Younger in this case corrected his design during underdrawing in line with his father's painted version. In this case, too, there is no indication of the outstretched arm in the original's underdrawing, suggesting that Bruegel the Elder himself changed his mind after transferring the image to panel. Bruegel's own pouncing dots for the outstretched arm are missing, and indeed there are none visible anywhere in this painting, which is to be expected, as normal practice would be to have wiped them away after underdrawing and before painting. We can assume, therefore, that the set of cartoons used within Bruegel the Younger's workshop was inherited directly from his father, and that this set of cartoons was in fact part of Bruegel the Elder's own preparatory work. And this, of course, tells us more about the workings of Bruegel the Younger studio. The Brussels version clearly uses the prick cartoon to transfer the image, but the artist corrects the design to reflect the final motifs in Bruegel the Elder's painting. The Brussels version, as well as the 2 other faithful copies, must have been made in the presence of his father's original version or an earlier copy. The atypical Sotheby's version, on the other hand, was probably delegated by Bruegel the Younger to an assistant or subcontractor, and he had to execute it based only on the cartoons and a model drawing of the whole composition, perhaps with some colour notes, but without seeing Bruegel the Elder's version or a faithful copy. So we can take this realization a step further and test the idea that the Sotheby's version is to a certain extent the painted representation of Pieter Bruegel the Elder's preparatory design. So let's look at these rooftops here. You can see that in the Sotheby's version, there are 2 gabled windows that are not in the original version. However, when you peek behind the surface of the original, you can see drawing lines for these 2 windows. And here, on the wall of the inn, you can see 3 motifs that are different in the original and the Sotheby's version. The notice on the left, the diagonal brace for the wooden post in the middle, and the decorative brick arches to the right, which comprise 1 arch in the original and 2 in the Sotheby's copy. So, looking behind the surface of the original, you can see that Bruegel the Elder's underdrawing shows the motifs as they appear in the copy. There they are. So we've got the notice on the wall, the brace, and the 2 arches rather than 1. I'll show one more example, although there are more. In front of the Carnival, here, strewn on the ground, are some broken eggs. But there's one more in the Sotheby's copy. So peeking behind the surface in the original shows that it was indeed foreseen, but that Bruegel the Elder thought better of it and decided to drop it during painting. The Sotheby's copy, again, shows Bruegel's original plan. The Sotheby's copy also shows us that Bruegel the Elder decided to add some motifs during underdrawing or painting, such as these 2 figures leaning against the church wall, which are absent in the Sotheby's copy and therefore must have been absent on Bruegel's original design. All these small differences in the Sotheby's copy shows us that Bruegel the Elder continued to develop his design during both underdrawing and painting. In Bruegel the Younger's case, thanks to the incredibly detailed preparatory material he must have inherited from his father, he was able to create an entire copying enterprise and satisfy a market ever hungry for precise reproductions of Bruegelian compositions. Stylistically, it is obvious which version is the original, and I'd like to show you that here. As you can see, Bruegel the Elder's brushwork is looser and more masterful than in any of the copies. But between the Brussels and Sotheby's versions, you can also see a difference in style and quality. And it is our contention that the Brussels version was painted by Bruegel the Younger himself, and the Sotheby's version by an assistant or subcontractor. The Sotheby's version is indeed polished and finely painted, and was no doubt sold by Bruegel the Younger as part of his commercial production. So to further explore Pieter Bruegel the Younger's copying practice, let's now take a wonderful snow scene, the census at Bethlehem. This large format painting shows the biblical episode of the census at Bethlehem ordered by Emperor Augustus. You can see Mary and Joseph making their way across the snowy landscape to the tavern at the left, where people are queuing up to pay their taxes. Bruegel may allude to the Spanish occupation of the Netherlands and the despised practice of tax collecting during his own period, although a recent theory put forward by Tina McGank in a new book on Bruegel's winter scenes says that it's not a criticism at all, but refers to the person she identifies as the patron, Jan Vlamink. He was a wealthy individual who lent money to the ruler of the Netherlands, King Philip II of Spain, and to the governor, Margaret of Parma. Vlamink had a large country estate in Wenegem, and the house apparently in the middle of this painting is actually an accurate rendering of a farmhouse in Wenegem at the time. According to McGank, Philip II made Vlamink a lord in return for his considerable financial services, and therefore he was allowed to collect manorial dues. This therefore explains the tax collecting scene at the inn with the Habsburg insignia. The original painting is in the Royal Museums of Fine Arts of Belgium, and I've studied it in great detail, along with 7 of the copies. There are, in fact, 14 known copies of this composition from Pieter Bruegel the Younger's studio. They're all very big, the same size as the original, about 1 meter 70 wide, and mostly they're on oak panel. So I'd like you to notice first some interesting differences in motif and color between the original and the copies. First, notice here that the red setting sun, which sets the tone and atmosphere for the original version, is entirely missing in the copies. And here, you can see that the skater is missing. But Bruegel the Younger also seems to have misunderstood some motifs. For example, the hole in the ice gets transformed into a snow-covered rock. He also misses out the rather iconic bird which is walking on the submerged barrel. And another misunderstood motif is this ring here in the original, probably from a barrel, that Bruegel the Younger has interpreted as a sack. And finally, look at the dog. In the original version, he looks like a type of retriever or setter. But in the copies, it's a brown and white dog like a spaniel. So what do all these differences tell us? In fact, they suggest that the son in this copy did not copy the painting itself, but based his copies on a drawing of his father's painting. This was probably a preparatory drawing inherited from his father, as we've seen with the battle between Carnival and Lent. So to investigate how Bruegel the Younger transferred his design to panels, I made tracings of 6 of these copies and overlaid them one on top of the other. And what I found was that although the whole composition does not align all at once, several groups of motifs line up closely enough to suggest that partial cartoons were used in the making of the copies. I then laid one of these tracings on the original version, and in fact the motifs fit quite well. And this diagram highlights the areas where the same cartoons may have been used by the father for the original and the son some 30 to 40 years later. We think, in fact, that to make his copies of the census, Bruegel the Younger must have had, first, a model drawing of the whole composition, probably a drawing that his father made in preparation for the original painting, and second, a set of smaller sheets with individual groupings of motifs to be used as cartoons. And these would have been pricked for transfer, as with the battle between Carnival and Lent. I'd now like to turn to the tricky question of style and attribution. Aside from the obvious differences in motif, you might ask if there's a real difference in style between Pieter Bruegel the Elder's original version and Pieter Bruegel the Younger's copies. And indeed there is. The figures in the original are much more convincing than those in the copies. And the fire, as you see, is much more naturalistic. The colours in the original are more subdued and blend in much better with the landscape, the copies being much more anecdotal. And let's look at these snowballing figures. You can see that the figures in Bruegel the Elder's version really seem to move. The figure leaning down is hurrying to pick up his stock of snowballs, perhaps worried that he's about to receive one down his neck from the boy running towards him. He's already got one on his shoulder, shown by a blob of white paint. In the copy, the figures are rather stiff and awkwardly proportioned, and the running figure on the left is looking upwards and not where he's going. So Bruegel the Elder's version stands out for its superior sense of movement, gesture, and brushwork. But you might ask the question, given the amount of copies from Bruegel the Younger, whether he could have done it all himself or whether he had help. And in fact, we know he had assistants, as the Antwerp Guild of St. Luke registers 9 apprentices working with him at various points in his career. The dates of their entry as assistants suggest he had 1 or 2 students at each time, each remaining with him for a few years before leaving and setting up as artists. Some, however, could have remained working with him after their apprenticeship. A couple of famous pupils are Franz Snyders and Gonzales Cox. In the case of the census, all the copies we have studied are from Bruegel the Younger's workshop, as they all use the same set of cartoons and share the same basic technical fingerprint. They have the same type of underdrawing and identical painterly reserves. But on the basis of style, we can see that Bruegel certainly delegated some of these copies to assistants. And I'll take as an example 2 signed and dated versions, one from the Royal Museums of Fine Arts in Brussels, dated 1610, and the other from a private collection, dated 1604. And they're both signed, as you can see, on the side of a wagon. Not all Bruegel the Younger's paintings are signed, but the signed ones do tend to be the best ones, and we attribute most of them to his own hand. However, in this case, I think that these two paintings are in fact by two different artists. So let's first look at their underdrawings. Notice first of all the same basic underdrawing type, which could be referred to as Bruegel's house style, typical linear outline drawing in a dry medium. And now I want you to notice the stylistic differences that I believe reveal two different hands. First, in the 1610 version, you can see that the figures are drawn in a more spontaneous and sketchy way than those in the 1604 version, which are more mechanical and strictly copied. And we can see the same sort of differences in these hens, the ones on the left simply better drawn than those on the right. And now let us look at their respective paint layers. In the 1610 version, the figures seem to progress forward in a naturalistic manner. In the 1604 version, the figure carrying the large sack appears totally unbalanced, and the figure behind him has a hat that seems squashed down upon his shoulders, leaving no room for his head. And here, also in the 1610 version, you can clearly see a child begging for money, unlike in the 1604 version, where the hand gesture has become meaningless. Architecture is also better understood in the 1610 version, as demonstrated by this curving wall. So I think we can safely conclude that these two copies are underdrawn and painted by different hands. But before moving on, I'd like to draw your attention to another inscription in the 1604 version, which is so minuscule that I only stumbled across it by chance. And this consists of the remains of tiny letters painted in a rather beautiful formal script on the wooden door of the house of the leper. The writing style is quite different to that of Bruegel's signature, and unlike the style of inscriptions nor insigns. When viewed in a mirror, you turn it round, it appears to read Van Can, the potter, which is a Flemish name. So we could be looking at the hidden signature, perhaps that of a studio assistant responsible for the copy. It could, of course, be the hidden signature of some past painting restorer wishing to leave his mark. To continue our consideration of attribution, let's take one of Bruegel the Elder's most exquisite creations, the winter landscape with bird trap. And this is part of the Bruegel exhibition and comes from the Royal Museums of Fine Arts in Brussels. It's a small painting on oak panel made up of one single board, 37 centimeters in height. There are over 50 identical copies from Bruegel the Younger's studio, and I've studied 6 of these from a technical point of view. So you might actually wonder how we know that this one is the original, given the enormous number of copies. And first, there's the question of its provenance. The painting was in fact rediscovered in 1925 by Dr. Delporte, who bought it at the Louis Monteau Gallery in Brussels. There's no really reliable mention of it before then, since 1659, when a painting on the same theme was cited in the inventory of the collection of Archduke Leopold William of Austria, one-time governor of the southern Netherlands. What raises our suspicions is that Dr. Delporte had the painting cleaned by none other than Joseph van der Weyken, the notorious painter, restorer, forger. And it was during the cleaning that the signature was revealed in the lower right corner. And indeed, the painting did provoke controversy when it was first exhibited. It was shown for the first time in early 1927 at the Royal Academy in London, where it was proclaimed as Bruegel's lost original. Roger Fry, the famous art critic, initially published a glowing commentary in the March issue of the Burlington magazine for connoisseurs. However, he retracted his comments in the May issue and, without mentioning van der Weyken's name, claimed it was made by the same forger who had made another painting in the exhibition. His conclusion was immediately criticised by A.P. Laurie, Professor of Chemistry at the Royal Academy, in a letter to the Times on the 20th of May. He accused Fry of straying out of his field of expertise, saying he should not talk about the appearance of the crack pattern without microscopic examination. Laurie then got permission from Dr. Delporte to examine the painting himself with a microscope. And he communicated his results in a letter to the Times on the 13th of September. He stated that the results of his examination showed that Roger Fry was mistaken, and in regard to the signature, he said that it was full of cracks, and that are continuous with those of other cracks in the paint, and therefore that it does belong to the same date as the picture. So let's now consider the signature that was exposed during Van der Weken's cleaning. Its appearance conforms to the style of some of Bruegel's signatures during the 1560s, such as, for instance, the Suicide of Saul, which is also slightly clumsy with uneven lettering. And the cracks, after my microscopic examination, do indeed go right through the paint and into the paint behind. However, confusingly, there is a second similar signature underneath, painted in lead white, which shows up in the X-ray. So here's the top signature, and here's the one underneath. So you might start to doubt the authenticity of the whole thing. But I think, in fact, that Bruegel simply signed his name twice. He may have thought he was finished, and then decided to rework this corner of the painting, adding the twisty tree to your right, which is here on the right, as an afterthought, a sort of framing device that helps lead your eye into the painting. We discovered another feature that we hope might identify the artist: a finger or thumbprint pressed into the dark transparent paint in a hole in the ice in the foreground. This was likely intentional to lighten the glaze somewhat. And unfortunately, there are not enough characteristic identification points for comparison with other fingerprints in Bruegel's paintings. More reassuringly, we had some evidence on the painting's authenticity from the wooden support. Dendrochronology, carried out by my former colleague Josef van Kier, was used to study the tree rings. He found that the most recent tree ring was a sapwood ring dating from 1551, making it perfectly feasible that the panel was painted in 1565, the date inscribed on the painting. But more exciting for the attribution to Bruegel came from Pascal Freiture, whom you've seen here, and who is head of dendrochronology at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage. She shared this dendrochronological data with her counterpart, Ian Tyers, in England, who has recently studied 2 paintings by Bruegel of the same size and with the same method. And together, they were able to prove that in each case, the wood planks used in these 3 paintings come from exactly the same tree. And these are the landscape with a flight into Egypt from the Courtauld Institute, painted 2 years before, in 1563, and the Death of the Virgin from the National Trust at Upton House, painted around 1565, both of which you can see in the exhibition. So this evidence clearly links these 3 paintings together and makes it more likely that this winter landscape with bird trap is indeed the original version by Pieter Bruegel the Elder. But the wood, obviously, cannot provide the ultimate proof of authenticity. You need to look at the painting itself, its underdrawing, its genesis, and its painterly style. In this detail here, you can clearly make out the drawing, which is rapidly applied and quite sketchy. And of key importance, the underdrawing includes several reworkings and changes. For example, here, the arched tops of 2 gabled windows, whose outlines are vigorously sketched in several times. Copyists rarely rework motifs in this way, and Bruegel the Younger never did. And a further point supporting this painting as the original version relates to the bird trap itself. And this is the motif defining the meaning and subsequent interpretation of the painting for generations of art historians. Astonishingly, this motif is not present in the underdrawing, and this is unlike the copies, where the bird trap is always underdrawn. And in the X-ray of the original painting, we can also see there is no painterly reserve. The bird trap has been painted straight on top of the surrounding snow, and most other forms, such as the tree on the left here, are reserved in the snow paint and appear dark in the X-ray. In the X-ray of the copy, you can see a dark patch where the bird trap is painted, which shows that the motif was reserved in the background paint. The lack of underdrawing and the lack of a reserve suggests that Bruegel the Younger did not intend to include the bird trap in his initial composition, or had planned to put it elsewhere. And it's possible that a mysterious set of underdrawing lines lying to the right of the bird trap, just here, could correspond to an initial sketch for the trap. It could, of course, represent branches, the outline of a building, a fallen tree, a gate, or something to hold up drifted snow. And hidden strokes of white paint in the X-ray indicate that the artist had actually started to paint something in this zone. It does seem a little large for a trap, though. Bruegel later covered these over with a dark tree, and this change of mind could explain why Bruegel signed his painting twice in this corner. And finally, if we compare the original version and any of the copies, we can see that its painting style is quite different. That of Bruegel the Younger is more graphic, distinguishing it from his father's much more nuanced painterly style. So what about distinguishing Pieter Bruegel the Younger's copies from those produced by other copyists outside Pieter Bruegel the Younger's studio? I was asked to give my opinion on this painting from a private collection. It's on wood panel, and at first glance, the painting appears to be a very faithful rendering of the composition. The question is, could it have originated in Bruegel the Younger's workshop, or is it by some anonymous follower? There are two details that set this copy apart from Bruegel the Elder's version and link it to Bruegel the Younger's studio. The first are the figures on the bridge, which do not appear in the original version, and they only appear in about 5 of the 50 or so copies by Bruegel the Younger, as in this one you see here from the Meyer van den Berg Museum in Antwerp, which is signed and dated 1622. So this proves that the privately owned version was either executed in Bruegel the Younger's workshop or copied after one of Bruegel the Younger's versions. And the second atypical motif is here. It's the flight from Egypt. And again, it doesn't appear in the original version by Bruegel the Elder, but is present in both these copies. So far, so good. I made a tracing of the painted outlines of the copy and found that there was an extremely close correlation with my tracing of the Meyer van den Berg version. You might expect, therefore, that the privately owned version was carried out in the workshop of Bruegel the Younger, using his habitual pricked cartoon, the artist joining up the powdery dots with black underdrawing prior to sweeping away the evidence of pouncing. However, in infrared, not a single trace of underdrawing was visible. So here you have a detail from the Antwerp version, showing underdrawing clearly for the town and for the trees on the horizon and for all the houses. But in the privately owned version, there is no underdrawing whatsoever visible in infrared. All the black lines you do see are either the age crack pattern or the paint strokes. This lack of underdrawing is unprecedented in the work of Bruegel the Younger, and I've now examined more than 100 of his paintings. So it's therefore a good initial argument to exclude the painting from the artist's workshop. But before going on to examine the paint, let's just consider, if he didn't use Bruegel's usual method, how did this copyist transfer his detailed design to panel? The answer was revealed by microscopic examination. There is indeed an underdrawing, but it is done in a red material, probably red chalk, that is totally invisible in infrared. Red chalk was never used by Bruegel the Younger for his underdrawings. It's of course possible that the copyist himself traced a copy by Bruegel the Younger, as I do, which might explain fidelity of outline. Examining this painting further, we can see from the edge, and also through some cracks, that the ground layer is not white but ochre-coloured, something we've never seen in Bruegel the Younger's works. My colleague, Stephen Savawains, carried out X-ray fluorescence of the ground layer and found out that zinc white was predominant. Zinc white was a pigment only produced on a commercial scale from the 1840s. Therefore, this work is a late copy. As I promised at the beginning, I'm going to finish by showing you briefly the case of the Fall of Icarus. This painting has been the cause of numerous controversies over its authorship ever since it was purchased by the Royal Museums of Fine Arts of Belgium in 1912. It was in fact bought for £100 from the Sackville Gallery in London on the advice of the great Belgian art historian and Bruegel expert Georges Houlin-de-Loo, but as a copy after a lost work by Bruegel. Nonetheless, since that time, several historians have given it to Bruegel, including Max Friedlander, although there are few art historians today who support the attribution. Manfred Selling, for example, does not recognize it. In fact, there is not just one Fall of Icarus, but two. The other is in the Van Buren Museum in Brussels. Over the years, there's been much debate as to which one is the original. So we examine them both technically and stylistically. We can first of all eliminate the Van Buren version. Through dendrochronology, because it's on wood panel, we found that the tree on which the panel was painted was still growing in the forest when Bruegel died. In other words, it was painted after his death. The Royal Museums of Fine Arts version is painted on canvas, and this was dated by Mark van Strijdonk at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage in Brussels in 1998 by carbon-14 dating. And this showed that the greatest probable date for the canvas was between 1555 and 1635, but the greatest possibility was between 1582 and 1625, a period after the life of Bruegel, who died in 1569. But let's consider the paint layer. The painting is quite abraded, but in the better preserved parts, we can see that it does not have the painterly quality of a work by Bruegel the Elder. For example, here, the labourer. The figure lacks any impression of movement, above all when you compare him with figures in other paintings by Bruegel, such as this mounted figure in the Procession to Calvary, and this figure from the Return of the Herd. And we can also find differences in style in the rocky cliffs in the background. You can see how weakly the ones in the Fall of Icarus are painted, compared to a detail of cliffs in the background of the Return of the Herd. Third, for attribution, of course, it's useful to examine the underdrawing. In fact, the whole composition is underdrawn, but it does not recall the types of underdrawing we have found in paintings by Bruegel the Elder, nor in that of paintings by Bruegel the Younger or his brother Jan. It's stiff and hesitant and lacking in confidence. And so here you have the two paintings side by side, neither of which are by Bruegel the Elder. They remain anonymous copies, most likely after a lost painting by Bruegel the Elder, as the Fall of Icarus by Bruegel the Elder is mentioned as part of the Imperial Collection in Prague in 1621. As such, these copies are very important witnesses to what must have been a spectacular original work. And if any of you find it, please let me know. Thank everybody for their attention, and thank you particularly the Dorothea Auction House for their support for this conference.